The Handbook of Hymen. 'Tis the opinion of myself, Sanderson Pratt, who sets this down, that the educational system of the United States should be in the hands of the Weather Bureau. I can give you good reasons for it, and you can't tell me why our college professors shouldn't be transferred to the meteorological department. They have been learned to read, and they could very easily glance at the morning papers and then wire into the main office what kind of weather to expect. But there's the other side of the proposition. I am going on to tell you how the weather furnished me in Idaho Green with an elegant education. We was up in the Bitterroot Mountains over the Montana line prospecting for gold. A chin-whiskered man in Walla Walla, carrying a line of hope as excess baggage, had grub-staked us. And there we was in the foothills pecking away, with enough grub on hand to last an army through a peace conference. Along one day comes a mail rider over the mountains from Carlos, and stops to eat 3 cans of green peas and leave us a newspaper of fairly modern date. This paper prints a system of premonitions of the weather, and the card it dealt Bitterroot Mountains from the bottom of the deck was, "Warmer and fair with light westerly breezes." That evening it began to snow, with the wind strong in the east. Me and Idaho moved camp into an old empty cabin higher up the mountain, thinking it was only a November flurry. But after falling 3 foot on a level, it went to work in earnest, and we knew we was snowed in. We got in plenty of firewood before it got deep, and we had grub enough for 2 months, so we let the elements rage and cut up all they thought proper. Now then, if you want to instigate the art of manslaughter, just shut 2 men up in an 18 by 20 foot cabin for a month. Human nature won't stand it. When the first snowflakes fell, me and Idaho Green laughed at each other's jokes and praised the stuff we turned out of a skillet and called bread. At the end of 3 weeks, Idaho makes this kind of a edict to me. Says he, "I never exactly heard sour milk dropping out of a balloon on the bottom of a tin pan, but I have an idea it would be music of the spears compared to this attenuated stream of asphyxiated thought that emanates out of your organs of conversation. The kind of half-masticated noises that you emit every day puts me in mind of a cow's cud, only she's lady enough to keep hers to herself, and you ain't." After a moment's serious reflection and in view of the evidence, I replies like this. "Mr. Green," says I, "you haven't been a friend of mine once. I have some hesitations in confessing to you that if I had my choice for society between you and a common yellow 3-legged cur pup, one of the inmates of this here cabin would be wagging a tail just at present." We goes on in this way of debate for 2 or 3 days. Then we quit speaking to one another altogether. We divides up the cooking implements, and Idaho cooks his grub on one side of the fireplace and me on the other. The snow was up to the windows, and we have to keep a fire all day. You see, me and Idaho never had any education beyond reading and doing "If John had 3 apples and James 5" on a slate. We never felt any special need for a university degree, though we had acquired a species of intrinsic intelligence in knocking around the world that we could use in emergencies. But snowbound in that cabin in the Bitterroots, we felt for the first time that if we had studied Homer or Greek and fractions and the higher branches of information, we'd have had some resources in the line of meditation and private thought. I've seen them Eastern college fellows working in camps all through the West, and I never noticed but what education was less of a drawback to 'em than you would think. Why, once over on Snake River, when Andrew McWilliams' saddle hoss got the bots, he sent a buckboard 10 miles for one of these strangers that claimed to be a botanist. But that horse died. One morning, Idaho was poking around with a stick on the top of a little shelf that was too high to reach. 2 books fell to the floor. I started toward 'em, but caught Idaho's eye. He speaks for the first time in a week. "Don't burn your fingers," says he. "In spite of the fact that you're only fit to be the companion of a sleeping mud turtle, I'll give you a square deal, and that's more than your parents did when they turned you loose in the world with the sociability of a rattlesnake and the bedside manner of a frozen turnip. I'll play you a game of 7-up, the winner to pick up his choice of the book, the loser to take the other." We played, and Idaho won. He picked up his book, and I took mine. Then each of us got on his side of the house and went to readin'. I never was as glad to see a 10-ounce nugget as I was that book, and Idaho took at his like a kid looks at a stick of candy. Mine was a little book about 5 by 6 inches called Herkimer's Handbook of Indispensable Information. I may be wrong, but I think that was the greatest book that ever was written. I've got it today, and I can stump you or any man 50 times in 5 minutes with the information in it. Talk about Solomon or the New York Tribune. Herkimer had cases on both of them. That man must have put in 50 years and traveled 1,000,000 miles to find out all that stuff. There was the population of all cities in it, and the way to tell a girl's age, and the number of teeth a camel has. It told you the longest tunnel in the world, the number of the stars, how long it takes for chicken pox to break out, what a lady's neck ought to measure, the veto powers of governors, the dates of the Roman aqueducts, and how many pounds of rice going without 3 beers a day would buy. It also told the average annual temperature of Augusta, Maine, the quantity of seed required to plant an acre of carrots in drills. It told antidotes for poisons, the number of hairs on a blonde lady's head, how to preserve eggs. Why, it told the height of all the mountains in the world, and the dates of all wars and battles, and how to restore drowned persons and sunstroke and the number of tacks in a pound, and how to make dynamite and flowers and beds, and what to do before the doctor comes, and 100 times as many things besides. If there was anything Herkimer didn't know, I didn't miss it out of the book. I sat and read that book for 4 hours. All the wonders of education was compressed in it. I forgot the snow, and I forgot that me and old Idaho was on the outs. He was sitting still on a stool, reading away, with a kind of partly soft and partly mysterious look shining through his tan whiskers. "Idaho," says I, "what kind of a book is yours?" Idaho must have forgot too, for he answered moderate, without any slander or malignity. "Why," says he, "this here seems to be a volume by a feller name of Homer K.M. "Homer K.M. what?" I asks. "Why, just Homer K.M., says he. "Idaho Green, you're a bald-faced liar," says I, a little riled that Idaho should try to put me up a tree. "No man is going round signing books with his initials. If it's Homer K.M. Spoopendike or Homer K.M. McSweeney or Homer K.M. Jones, why don't you say so like a man, instead of biting off the end of it like a calf chewing off the tail of a shirt on a clothesline? I put it to you straight, Sandy, says Idaho, quiet. It's a poem book, says he, by Homer K.M. I couldn't get color out of it at first, but there's a vein if you follow it up. I wouldn't have missed this book for a pair of red blankets. Humph, says I. You're welcome to it, says I. What I want is a disinterested statement of facts for the mind to work on, and that's what I seem to find in the book I've drawn. What you've got, says Idaho, is statistics, the lowest grade of information that exists. They'll poison your mind. Give me old K.M.'s system of surmises. He seems to be a kind of wine agent. His regular toast is nothing doing, and he seems to have a grouch. But he keeps it so well lubricated with booze that his worst kicks sound like an invitation to split a quart. But it's poetry, says Idaho. And I have sensations of scorn for that truck of yours that tries to convey sense in feet and inches. When it comes to explaining the instinct of philosophy through the art of nature, old K.M. has got your man beat by drills, rows, paragraphs, chest measurement, and average annual rainfall. So that's the way me and Idaho had it. Day and night, all the excitement we got was studying our books. And credit where credit is due, that snowstorm sure fixed us both up with a fine lot of attainments apiece. By the time the snow melted, if you had stepped up to me suddenly and said, "Sanderson Pratt, what would it cost per square foot to lay a roof with 20 by 28 tin at $9.50 per box?" I'd have told you as quick as light could travel the length of a spade handle at the rate of 192,000 miles per second. How many can do it? You wake up most any man you know in the middle of the night and ask him quick to tell you the number of bones in the human skeleton, exclusive of teeth, or what percentage of the vote of the Nebraska legislature overrules a veto. Will he tell you? Try him and see. About what benefit Idaho got out of his poetry book I didn't exactly know. Idaho boosted the wine agent every time he opened his mouth, but I wasn't so sure. This Homer K.M., from what leaked out of his libretto through Idaho, seemed to me to be a kind of a dog who looked at life like it was a tin can tied to his tail. After running himself half to death, he sits down, hangs his tongue out, and looks at the can and says, "Oh, well, since we can't shake the growler, let's get it filled at the corner and all have a drink on me." Besides that, it seems he was a Persian, and I never hear of Persia producing anything worth mentioning unless it was Turkish rugs and Maltese cats. That spring, me and Idaho struck Peor. It was a habit of ours to sell out quick and keep moving. We unloaded our grubstaker for $8,000 apiece, and then we drifted down to the little town of Rosa on the Salmon River to rest up and get some human grub and have our whiskers harvested. Rosa was no mining camp. It laid in the valley and was as free of uproar and pestilence as one of them rural towns in the country. There was a 3-mile trolley line champing its bid in the environs, and me and Idaho spent a week riding on one of the cars, dropping off at nights at the Sunset View Hotel. Being now well-read as well as traveled, we was soon pro re nata with the best society in Rosa, and was invited out to the most dressed-up and high-toned entertainments. It was at a piano recital and quail-eating contest in the City Hall for the benefit of the fire company that me in Idaho first met Mrs. DeOrmond Sampson, the queen of Rosa society. Mrs. Sampson was a widow and owned the only two-story house in town. It was painted yellow, and whichever way you looked from, you could see it as plain as egg on the chin of an O'Grady on a Friday. 22 men in Rosa, besides me in Idaho, was trying to stake a claim on that yellow house. There was a dance after the songbooks and quail bones had been raked out of the hall. 23 of the bunch galloped over to Mrs. Sampson and asked for a dance. I sidestepped the two-step and asked permission to escort her home. That's where I made a hit. On the way home, says she, "Ain't the stars lovely and bright tonight, Mr. Pratt?" "For the chance they've got," says I. "They're humping themselves in a mighty credible way. That big one, you see, is 66 million miles distant. It took 36 years for its light to reach us. With an 18-foot telescope, you can see 43 million of them, including them of the 13th magnitude, which, if one was to go out now, you would keep on seeing it for 2,700 years. "My," says Mrs. Sampson, "I never knew that before. How warm it is. I'm as damp as I can be from dancing so much." "That's easy to account for," says I. "When you happen to know that you've got 2 million sweat glands working all at once. If every one of your perspiratory ducts, which are 1/4 of an inch long, was placed end to end, they would reach a distance of 7 miles. "Lawsy," says Mrs. Sampson. "It sounds like an irrigation ditch you was describing, Mr. Pratt. How do you get all this knowledge of information?" "From observation, Mrs. Sampson," I tells her. "I keeps my eyes open when I go about the world." "Mr. Pratt," says she, "I always did admire a man of education. There are so few scholars among the sap-headed plug-uglies of this town that it is a real pleasure to converse with a gentleman of culture. I'd be gratified to have you call at my house whenever you feel so inclined." That was the way I got the goodwill of the lady in the yellow house. Every Tuesday and Friday evening I used to go there and tell her about the wonders of the universe as discovered, tabulated, and compiled from nature by Herkimer. Idaho and the other gay Lutherans of the town got every minute of the rest of the week that they could. I never imagined that Idaho was trying to work on Mrs. Sampson with old K.M.'s rules of courtship, till one afternoon when I was on my way over to take her a basket of wild hog plums. I met the lady coming down the lane that led to her house. Her eyes was snapping, and her hat made a dangerous dip over one eye. "Mr. Pratt," she opens up, "this Mr. Green is a friend of yours, I believe?" "For 9 years," says I. "Well, let me pointedly suggest you cut him out," says she. "He's no gentleman." "Why, ma'am," says I, "he's a plain incumbent of the mountains with asperities and the usual failings of a spendthrift and a liar, but I never on the most momentous occasion had the heart to deny that he was a gentleman. It may be that in haberdashery and the sense of arrogance and display Idaho offends the eye, but inside, ma'am, I've found him impervious to the lower grades of crime and obesity. After 9 years of Idaho society, Mrs. Sampson," I winds up, "I should hate to impute him, and I should hate to see him imputed." "It's right plausible of you, Mr. Pratt," says Mrs. Sampson, "to take up the curmudgeons in your friend's behalf, but it don't alter the fact that he has made proposals to me sufficiently obnoxious to ruffle the ignominy of any lady." "Why, now, says I. "Old Idaho do that? I could believe it of myself sooner. I never knew but one thing to deride in him, and a blizzard was responsible for that. Once, while we was snowbound in the mountains, he became a prey to a kind of spurious and uneven poetry, which may have corrupted his demeanor." "It has," says Mrs. Sampson. "Ever since I knew him, he has been reciting to me a lot of irreligious rhymes by some person he calls Ruby Ott, and who is no better than she should be, if you judge by her poetry." "Then Idaho has struck a new book," says I, "for the one he had was by a man who writes under the nom de plume of K.M." "He'd better have stuck to it," says Mrs. Sampson, "whatever it was. And today he caps the vortex. I get a bunch of flowers from him, and on 'em is pinned a note. Now, Mr. Pratt, you know a lady when you see her, and you know how I stand in Rosa society. Do you think for a moment that I'd skip out to the woods with a man along with a jug of wine and a loaf of bread, and go singing and cavorting up and down under the trees with him? I take a little claret with my meals, but I'm not in the habit of packing a jug of it into the brush and raising Cain in any such style as that. And of course he'd bring his book of verses along too. He said so. Let him go in his scandalous picnics alone, or let him take his Ruby Ott with him. I reckon she wouldn't kick, unless it was on account of there being too much bread along. And what do you think of your gentleman friend now, Mr. Pratt?" "Well, says I, "it may be that Idaho's invitation was a kind of poetry and meant no harm. Maybe it belonged to the class of rhymes they call figurative. They offend law and order, but they get sent through the mails on the ground that they mean something that they don't say. I'd be glad, on Idaho's account, if you'd overlook it," says I, "and let us extricate our minds from the low regions of poetry to the higher planes of fact and fancy. On a beautiful afternoon like this, Mrs. Sampson," I goes on, "we should let our thoughts dwell accordingly. Though it is warm here, we should remember that at the equator the line of perpetual frost is at an altitude of 15,000 feet. Between the latitudes of 40 degrees and 49 degrees, it is from 4,000 to 9,000 feet. "Oh, Mr. Pratt," says Mrs. Sampson, "it's such a comfort to hear you say them beautiful facts after getting such a jar from that minx of a Ruby's poetry." "Let us sit on this log at the roadside," says I, "and forget the inhumanity and ribaldry of the poets. It is in the glorious columns of ascertained facts and legalized measures that beauty is to be found. In this very log we sit upon, Mrs. Sampson," says I, "is statistics more wonderful than any poem. The rings show it was 60 years old. At the depth of 2,000 feet, it would become coal in 3,000 years. The deepest coal mine in the world is at Killingsworth, near Newcastle. A box 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet 8 inches deep will hold 1 ton of coal. If an artery is cut, compress it above the wound. A man's leg contains 30 bones. The Tower of London was burned in 1841. "Go on, Mr. Pratt," says Mrs. Sampson. "Them ideas is so original and soothing. I think statistics are just as lovely as they can be." But it wasn't till 2 weeks later that I got all that was coming to me out of Herkimer. One night I was waked up by folks hollering, "Fire!" all around. I jumped up and dressed and went out of the hotel to enjoy the scene. When I see it was Mrs. Sampson's house, I gave forth a kind of yell, and I was there in 2 minutes. The whole lower story of the yellow house was in flames, and every masculine, feminine, and canine in Rosa was there, screeching and barking and getting in the way of the firemen. I saw Idaho trying to get away from 6 firemen who were holding him. They was telling him the whole place was on fire downstairs and no man could go in it and come out alive. "Where's Mrs. Sampson?" I asks. "She hasn't been seen," says one of the firemen. "She sleeps upstairs. We've tried to get in, but we can't. Our company hasn't got any ladders yet." I runs around to the light of the big blaze and pulls the handbook out of my inside pocket. I kind of laughed when I felt it in my hands. I reckon I was some daffy with the sensation of excitement. "Herky, old boy," I says to it, as I flipped over the pages, "you ain't ever lied to me yet, and you ain't never throwed me down at a scratch yet. Tell me what, old boy? Tell me what?" says I. I turned to What to Do in Case of Accidents on page 117. I run my finger down the page and struck it. Good old Herkimer. He never overlooked anything. It said, "Suffocation from inhaling smoke or gas. There is nothing better than flaxseed. Place a few seed in the outer corner of the eye." I shoved the handbook back in my pocket and grabbed a boy that was running by. "Here," says I, giving him some money. "Run to the drugstore and bring $1 worth of flaxseed. Hurry, and you'll get another one for yourself." "Now," I sings out to the crowd, "we'll have Mrs. Sampson." And I throws away my coat and hat. 4 of the firemen and citizens grabs hold of me. "It's sure death," they say, "to go in that house," for the floors was beginning to fall through. "How in blazes," I sings out, kind of laughing yet, but not feeling like it, "do you expect me to put flaxseed in an eye without the eye?" I jabbed each elbow in a fireman's face, kicked the bark off one citizen's shins, and tripped the other one with a side hold, and then I busted into the house. If I die first, I'll write you a letter and tell you if it's any worse down there than the inside of that yellow house was. But don't believe it yet. I was a heap more cooked than the hurry-up orders of broiled chicken that you get in the restaurants. The fire and smoke had me down on the floor twice and was about to shame Herkimer. But the firemen helped me with their little stream of water, and I got to Mrs. Sampson's room. She'd lost conscientiousness from the smoke. So I wrapped her in the bedclothes and got her on my shoulder. Well, the floors wasn't as bad as they said, or I never could have done it. Not by no means. I carried her out 50 yards from the house and laid her on the grass. Then, of course, every one of them other 22 plaintiffs to the lady's hand crowded round with tin dippers of water ready to save her. And up runs the boy with the flaxseed. I unwrapped the covers from Mrs. Sampson's head. She opened her eyes and says, "Is that you, Mr. Pratt?" "Shh," says I. "Don't talk till you've had the remedy." I runs my arm around her neck and raises her head gentle, and breaks the bag of flaxseed with the other hand, and as easy as I could, I bends over and slips 3 or 4 of the seeds in the outer corner of her eye. And wouldn't you know, up gallops the village doc by this time, and snorts around and grabs at Mrs. Sampson's pulse and wants to know what I mean by any such sandblasted nonsense. "Well, old Jalap and Jerusalem Oakseed," says I, "I'm no regular practitioner, but I'll show you my authority anyway. Where's my—" Some honest citizens passing by sprang to my assistance. They fetched my coat, and I gets out the handbook. "Look on page 117, says I, at the remedy for suffocation by smoke or gas. Flaxseed in the outer corner of the eye, it says. I don't know whether it works as a smoke consumer or whether it hikes the compound gastro-hippopotamus nerve into action. But Herkimer says it, and he was called to the case first. If you want to make it a consultation, there's no objection." Old Doc takes the book and looks at it by means of his specs and a fireman's lantern. "Well, Mr. Pratt," says he, "you evidently got on the wrong line in reading your diagnosis. The recipe for suffocation says, get the patient into fresh air as quickly as possible and place in a reclining position. The flaxseed remedy is for dust and cinders in the eye, on the line above. But, after all—" "See here," interrupts Mrs. Sampson, "I reckon I've got something to say in this consultation. That flaxseed done me more good than anything I ever tried." And then she raises up her head and lays it back on my arm again and says, "Put some in the other eye, Sandy dear." And so, if you was to stop off at Rosa tomorrow or any other day, you'd see a fine new yellow house with Mrs. Pratt, that was Mrs. Sampson, embellishing and adorning it. And if you was to step inside, you'd see on the marble-top center table in the parlor Herkimer's Handbook of Indispensable Information, all rebound in red morocco and ready to be consulted on any subject pertaining to human happiness and wisdom.